show me the way. I've been out here feeling lost, trying to find my way. Show me the way, show me the way. Lord, show me the way. I'm feeling low, low, low. Lord, I need your direction, let me know, no, no. Show me the way. Yes, sir, show me the way. Yes, sir, show me the way. Show me, Lord, show me. Show me. Lord, show
life is better when we do it together. Peace.
Good morning. I want to welcome everybody to this month's edition to ReNew You. I am delighted to have with me Miss Roxy Reg. Go ahead and wave to the folks, Roxy.
Good morning.
All right, nice. We are going to be covering a very, very important topic this morning, and I'm excited about being able to get to it. But before we get started, I usually like to just make sure that we understand our foundational scripture. The purpose of the ReNew You ministry is about teaching us how to mature through life's moments. The fact of the matter is, things are going to happen in life. Not they might happen, they will happen. Okay, just as sure as we are born, we are going to die. Everybody has an appointed time in which they die. And so these things, although painful, should not surprise us. So with that said, let's look at our foundational scripture. That comes from Romans 12:2, and I'll read it. It simply says, "And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove that is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." What that translates to, if you hope to do any changing, if you want to exact any change in your life, it's going to start right here. That's the purpose of this ministry, is to get you thinking about what you may need to do differently. Okay. All right. So with that said, Pastor, go to those next slides so we can look at the upcoming topic on ReNew You. Today, we're going to talk about a form of disaster planning, if you will, planning for the unthinkable. In other words, we don't like to think about some of the things that we are actually watching happen and unfold in our country, across the world. So we're gonna talk about that just a little bit. Some upcoming ReNew Yous, which will be equally of interest. In August, we're gonna go through something called adverse childhood experiences. We're going to examine things that may have happened in your childhood. In many instances, for most of us, you'll be surprised to find out what you thought was normal actually had an impact on you, and the impact it's having on you today. And we'll learn some things that we can do to deliver ourselves from those things. And finally, in September, we're going to do a session on healing our communities. So I know we've got an exciting time coming up, and I'm looking forward to all of that. But with that said, let's go to that next slide. Let's start talking about planning for the unthinkable. Roxy, I'm going to hand this off to you. Go to that next slide and just tell us about some of the things that we're going to talk about individually.
Okay, so planning for the unthinkable. Some of the unthinkables are natural disasters, such as hurricanes, tornadoes, and just to point out a few, you can think of Hurricane Katrina and the damage that it done down in New Orleans. Something close to home, you can remember Gaston. I believe that was a tropical depression of some type that flooded out down on Main Street, as well as it flooded pretty much all of the South Side. Like there was major flooding. And then we had Hurricane Isabella that pretty much touched the state. So those are natural disasters. Pandemic, epidemic. So of course, when we think of pandemic, we think of COVID. So there is a difference between a pandemic and an epidemic. So a pandemic first starts out as an epidemic. An epidemic is something that affects a large number of people within a community. Then once it expands past a community and starts to affect states and countries, it becomes a pandemic.
Gotcha.
So in history, we've had um, the influenza was a pandemic. We've had some other ones that have affected us, just over the years. So the pandemics and the epidemics are nothing new.
Gotcha.
It's just kind of a repeat of history showing up in another form.
Gotcha. So what about the active shooter mass shooting thing? We're going to get in depth into all of that, but give us just a brief about what that's about.
So active shooter mass shooting. So an active shooter is something that is currently happening. It is happening and taking place right at that moment. Whereas a mass shooting is kind of the fallout from the active shooter, and that is based upon the number of people that were affected. So of course, if there's an active shooting or active shooter and he shot one or two people, that would not be deemed as a mass shooting. A mass shooting is when it is a large number of people, such unfortunately as the school shootings, as recently as the parade shooting, or the shooting in Las Vegas a few years ago at that concert. Those are mass shootings.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. So I want to give us, because we're going to talk more about it, but I want to give us some scriptural foundation for some things that we need to be remain vigilant about. Now, if someone's watching the broadcast and maybe you don't know the saving grace of God and the redemption available in Jesus Christ, now may be the time, okay? Because when these things begin to affect us on the level that they have the ability to affect us on, sometimes all we can do is call on the name of God. And so get that relationship going right now. Don't wait for something to happen and then you're feeling some kind of way. Get that in place right now and stay in touch with us if you need help on how to do that. But 1 Peter 5:8 says this. It says, be sober, in other words, well-balanced and self-disciplined, but also be alert and cautious at all times. That enemy of yours, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, fiercely hungry, seeking someone to devour. In other words, one of the things that we understand in our faith is that there is an adversary spiritually who constantly seeks to cause havoc within our lives. When we know and understand that, we can begin to watch and be vigilant for these things to happen. Okay. Now, it doesn't mean that we're anxious and caught up and preoccupied with them. No. Okay. But we are cautious. We are paying attention. Okay. So in Colossians, for instance, Colossians says, devote yourself to prayer, keeping alert in it with an attitude of thanksgiving. In other words, I need to be prayerful on a regular basis in terms of my safety, my family's safety, my community's safety, my city, my state, our country, the world. These are levels of prayer that we need to be offering up on a regular basis. I think of the fact that God says, if my people who are called by my name would humble themselves and pray and turn from their wicked ways, he says that then will I hear from heaven and then will I heal the land. Okay. And so here's something we can do actively to begin to make sure that we are protected on a daily basis. And I'll share this last one with you. The last one comes from Revelation 3:2 that simply says, wake up and strengthen the things that remain, which were about to die, for I have not found your deeds completed in the sight of my God. Now, that can be a confusing one, but what God is calling us to do, okay, is that in the midst of chaos, in the midst of mass confusion, He's calling us to remain vigilant. He's calling us to arms, to get ready to go into action, to get ready to serve. And that's one of the things that Roxanne and I have dedicated our lives to making sure that we are prepared to serve, not just in times of peace, but also in times of devastation. Roxanne, you got anything?
Amen. No, you've said it all.
Well, I don't like when I say it all because I'm positive either I said something I shouldn't have or I didn't say what I should have said. So let's go to that next slide. So when we talk about disasters, as a matter of fact, Roxanne, I'll let you take that. If you want to read it, you can. You don't have to.
Okay.
But natural disasters. Mm-hmm.
Natural disasters are large-scale geological or meteorological events that have the potential to cause loss of life or property.
So think of this on a large scale. Remember how you talked about Katrina?
Right?
And so in Katrina, as we know, the levees broke down in New Orleans. And what happened was when those levees broke, I want to say it was after a hurricane. Well, of course, it was after a Hurricane Katrina. And so what happened was it caused a flooding to occur. And I had a chance to go down to New Orleans. What has it been? Maybe about 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And can I tell you, Hurricane Katrina happened when? Roxanne, do you remember?
10 years ago, maybe more. No, it's more like 12. It's about 12 years ago.
Yeah, so it was a long time ago, but the devastation is still there. There are that one area that it devastated the most. There are homes that were never the same. They had to demolish them. Literally on each block in the area, you can see where maybe there's one home that remains, but all of the others are gone. It's just desolate and it's just horrible. And you can really see the effect that Hurricane Katrina had on it. Okay, so that's a great example as a natural disaster and the potential that it has to cause loss of life and property. Okay. Can we go to that next slide? So, Roxy, let me know if you have any comments on any of these, but these are some examples of things that we need to think about in terms of natural disasters. Me growing up in Detroit, in Southwest, tornadoes were a constant threat. We would always hear about tornado watch versus a tornado warning. Okay, the watch meant that we needed to pay attention that a tornado could happen at any moment versus a warning, which meant take cover. One has been spotted. What do you know about hurricanes? I'm not from this area, so.
Well, they're not really common in Virginia. We've had a few tornadoes, on the other hand. It seems like they're happening every week now. Wow. You know, just yesterday, and then even today, we're under severe storm watches. Wow. So these things can be produced at the drop of a dime almost. And, you know, just a couple of years ago, I was on my way home and got caught in one. So, you know, I have a little trauma related to storms now, but to get home and see the destruction of something that only lasts a few minutes can really, really rock your world. So that's why it's important, and we're talking about it today, to just get prepared for these things. And they're just small things that you can do to prepare for a storm so that it does not really uproot you in your daily routine.
Right. As a matter of fact, and we'll certainly get to that list as we get towards the end here. But that's one of the things that you mentioned was that the effect that it has on your mind. Number one, to see, for instance, in the case of Katrina, to see the number of people dead. Okay. But also to see the devastation where people, as well as yourself, have lost all of the things that you own. You now have nothing. And there's nothing you can do. And so it takes a mental toll on us. And that may be something that we look at in future ReNew use, is to look at, how we handle mentally, from a mental health standpoint, those types of things. We got tornadoes, we got hurricanes, we talked about floods with Katrina, wildfires. Now we're on the East Coast for the most part, but wildfires is something that's huge out in California, to the point where we, in many cases on this end of the country, can't even conceptualize it. The fact that a fire can start and then grow to the point where even firefighters can't put it out, and it rages on for days, months. And it takes with it not just our natural resources, trees and things like that, but also people's homes are affected because there's loss of homes and things like that. Speaking of California, earthquakes. They don't typically occur a lot in other parts of the country. Now, I say typically. They do happen every now and then. I remember we had one, I can't remember, it's about 5 years ago, and it was mild. Everyone just thought it was their imagination until we heard on the news that there was an earthquake, And so, when those tectonic, if I'm saying it right, plates under the earth shift, it causes a rumble, if you will. And if we've built any type of structures on top of those plates, then those structures are going to see some damage. And that's where we see roads demolished. We see bridges completely torn down, structures, buildings, things like that. So that's earthquakes.
Yeah, and we were actually affected here by the earthquake because it caused my grandmother's foundation on her house to crack.
Wow.
The shifting.
How about that? And sometimes, as I understand, and I'm no builder, but sometimes I understand that foundational damage sometimes can't be repaired.
Exactly.
It is what it is. And then the value of your home is gone.
Absolutely.
Wow. It's hard to imagine that we would suffer a drought. But it happened. Okay. I've seen some times. My daughter lives out in Nevada, in the middle of the desert. Okay. Now there's already no water out there. It rains very seldom. Okay. But all it takes is a few days of consecutive 100-degree days, which can happen. And they go on water shortage alert, where they're asked to conserve the amount of water that they use. And so it has the ability to affect your daily living, your ability to cook and provide for your family. So these things are absolutely huge. And there's other things, but because we could go on, but these are just a few of the things that have the potential to affect us in a way that cause loss of property, loss of life, and leave unerasable and indelible mark on us emotionally. So let's get into let's look at that next one. We'll get into mass shooting, active shooter. One of the things, and I want you to talk about it again, is that there's a difference, and it sounds like what you were talking about. Let's go to that next slide. I think what you were talking about, I'll read this just to see if I can make clarity of it. So it falls under the category that the CDC calls human-caused disaster. In other words, we brought it on ourselves. We do it. Examples included industrial accidents. I don't know if anyone's familiar with 5 Mile Island, the nuclear plant. Okay. Acts of terrorism. There was a few years back where what was the powder that was being discovered in all of the in folks' mail and mailboxes at places like this. I think it was anthrax.
Yeah, anthrax.
Yeah, and so we have things like that, and so we have all of these acts of terrorism as well as other things. Okay, so as with any natural disaster, these traumatic events have the ability to cause loss of life, loss of property. So on that next slide, let's talk about mass shooting, active shooters. So I think what I heard you say, and make sure you jump in and keep this clear for me. So an active shooter or active shooting is actually happening right now.
Right.
One way to look at it is, God forbid, I've read articles and news clippings about where people may be at work, because it could happen anywhere. The most recent one that happened at a parade on July the 4th. Prior to that, there was a shooting in Buffalo that happened in a grocery store.
Right.
And so with an active shooter, it's happening right now. Now, there's two ways to look at that. Right now is, right now I'm watching it on TV, but there's also, God forbid, the right now I'm a part of it. I'm watching it happening in real time. It's happening in my office. It's happening in the grocery store I'm in. It's happening at the parade that I'm at. Is that
right?
Am I on the right track there?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
So versus the mass shooting, one of the things that you mentioned, Roxy, was Las Vegas a few years ago. Now, the shooting in Buffalo that happened just a few months ago, that was a mass shooting because this young person, for reasons we may never understand, we're just not that advanced in mental health yet, but for reasons we may never fully understand, he drove 200 miles in armor, in body armor, with a helmet cam, went to a designated location. This wasn't a location that he picked randomly. What they uncovered was that the place he had studied this location, knew the times in which people would be frequented, knew that there would be a specific race, a high concentration of a specific race, and went there with the purpose and intent on killing people, and was successful. And what was interesting in this whole situation is he had a camera mounted to his helmet where he was streaming the whole thing live to some other website.
Madness.
Absolute madness. And so these were good people like you and I, that their lives were cut short in the midst of this. And not only were their lives cut short, but in many cases, they left behind loved ones who will grieve that loss for the rest of their lives. And that's usually the purpose of active terrorism like that, is to not only kill intended victims, but also to strike fear into the hearts of the public at large.
Correct.
You know,
and there's one thought that I want to insert into this, and that is, people often tell themselves, this can never happen to me. We often live under this falsehood, and it can happen. Just yesterday, I saw on the news here in our local area that there was a plan for a mass shooting on the 4th of July in the city of Richmond at Dogwood Dale. But someone, a innocent bystander, someone called in the tip,
How about that?
and therefore it was prevented. But that's home for us.
Right.
So there is no such thing as it can't happen to me. You know, it'll never happen to me at the grocery store. It won't happen to me at my church, because it can happen.
Right. And speaking of churches, and we'll kind of get into some things that we can do to prepare for that. But yeah, churches have, through history, especially Black churches, have always been a target of terrorism. Okay, fires and fire bombings and shootings
Yes.
and things like this. And yeah, the natural thought, Roxanne, is that it won't happen to us. As a matter of fact, that's kind of, just to get mental health for a second, that's actually a defense mechanism that keeps us from worrying too much about it.
Yeah.
Because if we worry too much about it, we become neurotic, and we become preoccupied with it. So rather than become neurotic and preoccupied, we tell ourselves something that may not be true, which is, it can't happen to me. Yes, it can. Yes, it can. Thank you. Thank you for that. That's an excellent point there. Let's look at that next slide, because the next slide actually jumps into some other type of mass violence. Okay, we talked about some of them. Bombings. I've been around long enough that I remember where did that happen? Oklahoma. Okay. That was a federal building that was bombed that killed a bunch of people. What's interesting is that these are acts of terrorism, but these are domestic terrorists. These are not people wearing turbans on their heads. These are domestic terrorists. These are people who live in this country that have developed a mindset that said, I don't agree with what's happening, and here's how I'm going to show it. So yeah, there's bombings. Okay, there's chemical biological agents. I talked about anthrax a little bit ago, but watch this third one: mass riots. Riots are an interesting phenomenon, because when we talk about protests, in most cases, they all start as a protest. And what happens is, the more people that join the protest, the more confusing it becomes about each person's motive. Roxy can start a peaceful protest, make the signs, sign up people, and want to do a peaceful demonstration. Paul, who doesn't even know Roxy, who has a real mental health issue and an axe to grind against the government and any other group, will join with Roxy and say, yeah, I support your cause. But the difference is, Paul is now inciting a riot, while Roxy meant it for good. And when we look at it on TV, we can't tell the difference. We had some rioting here locally a few years ago, and some people, during the rioting, burned down a local pharmacy, local drugstore. And what was interesting is that at first report, the thought was that was part of the rioting. But watch this. Fire investigators investigated the fire to find out that really it was a cover-up for theft. Because what they did was they broke in the store and stole all of the narcotic type drugs, all your Oxycontins, okay, all your Klonopin, anything that had to do with any type of painkiller, any opioid, any benzodiazepine, and stole those things. And then to cover their tracks, they burned the store down so that it would look like it was part of the riot. There's a perfect example. These people had a completely different motive that, if we don't pay attention, we thought was part of the riot, So riots, same thing on what was that? Was that this year or last year? I got to keep track here. When the mob stormed the Capitol.
Yeah.
I'm losing track of time already, you know. And so it's easy for a riot or a mob, if you will, to get out of control. Some of them assemble for the purposes of being out of control. Some of them are inciting violence. Okay.
Mhm.
And so, you know, we have to be vigilant for things like that, especially as people of color, because, you know, if we're not careful, we'll get targeted quite easily, you know.
Right.
I don't want to get too deep into transportation hijackings, but yeah, when we think of transportation hijacking, we're talking about 9/11, okay? And the demolishing of the World Trade Center. And interesting enough, this wasn't the first thing that had happened to the World Trade Center. This was actually a second. This was actually a second thing that actually happened. You know, so this wasn't. You know, it wasn't anything new. So,
Gotcha.
all right. So we got pandemic versus epidemic. What was that difference again?
So the epidemic is pretty much a local effect of something versus a pandemic. It has spread beyond the borders into other states, other countries, and it becomes a pandemic.
Okay. All right. And so pandemic versus an epidemic.
Mhm.
The epidemic is it more local or it's local?
It's a small group of people and it's local.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. So that's epidemic, that's pandemic. Okay. And we're still recovering for the effects of those as well. Let's move forward a couple of slides here. Okay. We want to get into what can we do? This is what we've been
Yes.
waiting on. What can we do? So,
So,
Roxy, if let's move to that slide. What can we do? And Roxy, let's talk about some things that we can do to prepare us for any of the things that we've talked about.
right. So any of these things that we've discussed that could happen, there is some basic preparation that will kind of cover you um, in general. And then there are some other specific things you can do based upon each event. But in general, you want to make sure that you have a minimum of a 5-day supply of water per person. And of course, depending on your age, the amount of water a person may consume will be different.
Mm-hmm.
If you're on medication, you want to at least have a 2-week supply on hand, because depending upon what the event is, your drugstore may be shut down. For instance, COVID, the pandemic has affected supply.
Right.
So if you have at least a 2-week supply on hand, then when you get to the end of your prescription, you still have your emergency stash.
Gotcha.
One way of obtaining an emergency stash is when you see your doctor, you can ask for samples. A
Gotcha.
lot of medications have samples. So if you go, every time you go to your doctor and you ask for a sample, you now have a stash on hand. Just,
Good.
keep in mind, check your expiration dates.
Excellent idea.
Yeah, absolutely. You want to have at least a 2-day change of clothing in the event that, something happens.
Mm-hmm.
And even when it comes to being stuck in your car. So I mentioned Gaston when it affected Richmond. Many people were caught in that flood and they were literally stuck in their cars.
Mm.
And I had several coworkers who were diabetic. They didn't have any medicine stashed in their car. So a lot of them ended up having diabetic emergencies.
Gotcha.
So you have protein bars, just some kind of snack in your car or, in your closet, depending upon, but you want to have medication. You want to have actual non-perishable food stored away that you can get a
Right.
hold of. And you can have these things at home in your car. The church can store these items in the event that they want to come to the aid of a community,
Mm-hmm.
local business as well. but there are just many small things that you can prepare. And we can certainly make available to you a list based upon, gender, age, and then also pet supplies. Because,
Mm,
a lot of people have, pets. So you want to make sure you have pet supplies on hand for emergencies.
all right. So
Something familiar.
this is actually a real good list. I don't want you to necessarily repeat it, but go back a little bit. So when we talk about things like water, medication, blankets, perishables, batteries, what does that help with? In other words, does that help with a pandemic? Does it help with what situation does it necessarily help with? Because we
So
talk
that
about
Absolutely. So that covers pretty much every situation we've named because with the pandemic, you're quarantining at home. So if you can't get out, you can't if the stores are closing, you have on-hand stuff. If you are experiencing a hurricane or tornado, flooding, any of those things, you lose power. Again, your way may be blocked from down trees, down power lines. So again, you can't get out. People can't get to you. So you
mm,
have these things on hand, and you're not necessarily cast into this emergency situation of lack because
ah,
you
you've
have something on hand to get through. It may not be a full meal, but you have enough to sustain you and your
gotcha.
family.
Now, there's a question I want to ask, and that is that you and I both we did our time in the military. And so, one of the things that you talked about at one point, in the event that there's an active shooter, you mentioned a couple of things. In other words, say I'm at my office building or I'm at, wherever, and I start hearing gunfire. You started talking
Right?
about some things that we could do, in
Mhm.
situations like that.
Absolutely. So, we have a running joke within my work office. We call it the apocalypse plan.
Mm,
So, what you do is you take a moment and you come up with a plan to say, if for some reason there's an active shooter,
right.
what would I do? What can I do? So, and that's being at work, at church, at home, in a grocery store, wherever. You should always familiarize yourself with your surroundings to know where your exits are. Even if it's not a designated exit, you can identify and say, well, you know what, I could use that as an exit. And if for some reason all of the exits that I've identified are not accessible, what
Mm,
is around me that I can use for cover to protect myself and my
excellent.
loved ones?
Excellent. That's some excellent ideas. So let's go to that last slide. We're going to get ready to wrap up here. This has been some excellent, excellent information. With there's some final thoughts we want to think about. Okay, in all of these circumstances, I don't care which one it applies to. Number one is stay vigilant. Roxy just talked about that. Pay attention to what you can use for concealment or cover. That was something that was reinforced in us in the military. Cover and
Yes.
conceal. Where can I hide? Where can I conceal myself? What advantages can I take advantage of? What exit can I use, even if it's only a window? I have to
Right.
stay vigilant. Pay attention to the news. Okay. I'm not a big news fan because if you're not careful, what happens is the news can be depressing. Okay. When you think about the state of the world that we live in, but pay attention to the news as things begin to unfold. That may be your only link to what's going on around you, especially if you're quarantined. Okay. Um, Stay in contact with people who love you. Okay.
Mhm.
Your support group is going to be more important than ever now. Brother, sister, mother, father, husband, wives, loved ones at church, people you're close with at your job, in business, whatever it is. If there's somebody close to you, stay in touch with them so they know what's happening with you and you know what's happening with them. In
Right.
3C, we say life is better when we do it together. It's true. For that reason, we know that we're not alone. Okay. We're not in this alone. We may seem isolated at that moment, but I know that if something happens somewhere, someone is trying to get a hold of me, somebody is wondering what's going on with me. And that's the way it should be.
Yes.
And lastly, stay in prayer. Okay. Not just be in prayer, but pray and watch.
Yes.
Don't let things catch you off guard. Okay. I used to have a deacon in my church a long time ago. He say, pray with one eye open. Watch. Pay attention. Don't be so heavenly minded, if you will, that you're no earthly good.
Right.
Roxanne, any final comments?
Just one final thought I'd like to share, and this can apply to an individual, a family, or a business or organization. Identify your strengths. So, as a business or an organization such as a church, know who's good at what. Give out assignments. Say, hey, in the event something happens, I need you to be responsible for this. If you know someone is good with people and prayer, then you identify that person as the person who will go around and check on people. So if they need immediate prayer, that person's comfortable praying. But if it's somebody who's good at delegating, so in businesses, it's the managers, it's the supervisors. In churches, it's the pastors, it's the elders, it's the deacons, it's the ministers. At home, it's the parents, the adults. But we all need to have our personal emergency plans. As Paul, don't get caught off guard. Make your plan now before anything happens. You'll have a plan so that if something happens and your husband's at work and you're at home, even if you can't talk to each other, you all have already designated a rendezvous point where you can meet so that you all know that each one is well. And again, that applies to individual, family, business, organization. But make a plan.
Talk real quickly. There's at every level of government, there are agencies that it is their responsibility to help with planning and being prepared with situations like that.
Absolutely. And there's one for Richmond. The city of Richmond has something they call CERT, and that's CERT, and it stands for City of Richmond Community Emergency Response Team. So this particular agency, you can contact them and you will be allowed to take a training to be better prepared for emergency responses. You don't have to be a doctor, a nurse, like EMT. You can just be an individual. There are so many agencies out there available for our help, but as an individual, you can get training because every city, every state, every county is responsible to have a emergency response plan. So you can go to your local fire department or police department, and they can direct you in the direction of getting in contact with those for emergency response plans. They will help you make a plan. They will train you in responding so that if an event takes place, they can call on you as a volunteer.
Excellent. Absolutely excellent. It's good to know that there's somebody, an agency at every level that is responsible for being able to help in situations like these. Like Roxy said, if you're a school, a church, an office, whatever it is, designate people, make plans. At my place of business, my job is to clear out the second floor and make sure everybody's cleared out, and then that they make it to the rendezvous point. Depending on what's happening, the rendezvous point may be out in the parking lot over by the dumpster. But if it's a tornado, then the rendezvous point is down in the basement in the bomb shelter. Okay. The point is, have a plan and ask. Don't be afraid. Ask your business, ask your church, ask your organization. Do we have a plan for this? And if not, why not? So I hope that everyone has found this beneficial. We are looking forward that you guys join us on our upcoming Renew You sessions for the month of August, where we'll talk about adverse child experiences. And then in the month of September, where we're talking about healing of our communities. Once again, I'm Paul Fletcher, Roxy Red. We thank you. And we hope
love
to
you.
see you.
Peace.